small steps that we can make in our own backyards and how those begin to add up over time and multiply the impact. If you're a follower of native plants and follower of regenerative agriculture or sustainability, or God forbid the wild ones that are all spread all across this country, the whole idea behind adding and integrating natives more and more into our landscapes because of all the natural benefits are really coming to the fore, and you see it more and more in the news, more and more every day. From animal health to bee health and backyard pollinators. And so Charlie is here today because Charlie is a big thinker about this small town of ours called St. Louis. And Charlie's seen a lot and talks to a lot of people about things. So we're going to try to create a meaningful conversation. And it's going to be fun trying to decide who's hosting who.
Oh, no.
Because
Chuck is the expert. Let me just be perfectly clear about that. And it's great to be here on the launch of the first podcast. I know how these things go with the ambient sound. If you're having some trouble hearing in the back, feel free to come on forward for the front row because we have a couple of seats available on this side. And we will do our best to speak to the last row of the audience, but it might be a little easier for everybody if you come a little forward. And then you can come and go as much as you want for a cup of coffee. Chuck, this coffee is fantastic. Where does it come from?
Where did it come from? The favorite store?
Daily Bread?
The Daily Bread, right around the corner here from Greenscape. Oh, and I got to say, we are hosting this. We have a great host this morning at Greenscape Gardens, maybe one of the most dynamic and best garden centers, one of our top garden centers in St. Louis County. If you need something that's green or something to put that green thing in, they can help you from the very beginning to the very end.
Yes. We happen to get our organic potting soil from here this spring, and our honest to goodness, our tomatoes have never looked better.
Yeah. Charlie has the biggest tomatoes in town. Who knew, right?
Well, as a matter of fact, the seeds for my tomatoes were given to me by a barber in Clayton at John's Barbershop in about 1992. The fellow was from Ravenna, Italy, and he gave me seeds that were a Burbank hybrid. And he said, try these. And I've been using the same seeds for, well, how many years is this? More than 30 years.
Wow. Well, there you go. That's all it takes, right? And really, if you think about plants, the plants that we're given or we share are always like the best, right? And so when you find a garden center that has great plants, it becomes the cocktail conversation.
Yes.
All you talk about is, oh, I just got the world's best liatris at Greenscape Gardens, and they're blooming like crazy. So next thing you know, everybody's coming here asking Sue and Jen for liatris. And by golly, they've got them. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the fun thing. You know, my mom was a big gardener. That's part of where my love came from gardening, was through my mother. And she loved to do little things. And I always gave her a hard time because she'd go out and she'd buy a tray of pansies in the spring. And she would call and say, oh, you got to come over and look at the pansies. And she'd put 3 in this corner of the yard and 3 in that corner of the yard and 3 over there. And I'd go, Ma, you got to put a flat over there. You got to put a flat over there. You got to put a whole flat over there, not just 3 little plants. And she would look at me and I go, Mom, those pansies are going to give their entire life for your enjoyment and for the color of your yard, right? And she goes, but I'm going to have to do that again next year. And I would say, but Mom, there's an alternative. Why don't you just do perennials? And then she would look at me and go, I don't have time for all that. Well, clearly she didn't have time for all the pansies that she needed. So little steps in our backyard. And we've talked a lot you and I have talked in the past about little steps where it's not just your backyard, but it's our community parks, our community trails, the Great Rivers Greenway Network, connecting parks through the community, through greenways, through old rail lines, using natives throughout these sites. Charlie, what's your impression of how have you seen St. Louis transform here over the last 30 years, 20 years?
Well, I will say, when I first got to town, In 1988, I was doing some Ask the Gardener shows for KMOX Radio with Ken Miller and Mike Miller and Skip Kincaid and others, and I know you've done some in recent years. And we had done some research at KMOX, which indicated that the number one hobby or pastime and sport in St. Louis was gardening. And that's really why I learned immediately that this was a town where people really liked to get in the backyard. And our shows proved it. We used to have a call-in show, and we would always rate the shows afterwards, how many calls came in. And if you got a lot of calls, it was called full boards. And the gardening shows always were full. But I think things changed. I think people are going to the native landscaping in their backyards. Are you familiar with the late Denny Waldum?
Mm-hmm.
He had his entire backyard re-landscaped with native plants. He was the first person I knew who did that. And once he told me about it, it seemingly everybody I knew was talking about going with the native landscaping. And that I think is the biggest change that I have seen in this town. I think we have a long way to go, especially in the public spaces, which we might get to. But in terms of people in their front yards, backyards, sometimes getting in trouble with the homeowners associations because they're going that way. Right. You see those stories in St. Peter's and elsewhere.
Yeah, so it's really interesting when you think about, if you take a step back up and 10,000 feet and say, well, what are the plants that we have that we grow, right? So heretofore, in the last 50 years, the horticulture world has created plants that bugs don't like. Makes a lot of sense, right? If I don't have to spray for bugs, then I don't have bugs on my plants. And there's even a company that comes and sprays your yard and fogs it for mosquitoes, which they kill everything. And what we've come to realize is our interdependency on the whole insect world. And in order for the insect world to be popular and to grow and be here, we got to have native plants for them to do their thing. There's a great entomologist out of University of Delaware named Doug Tallamy. I think many of you might have read his books. He talks a lot about how do chickadees raise their young? How many caterpillars, right? Because that little bitty black-capped bird that we see at our bird feeder that we all fall in love with in the wintertime is not feeding its young in the springtime seed. It's feeding their young caterpillars. So by the time those birds reach and fletch and become adults, from chicks to adults, it might take 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise that clutch. So where do those caterpillars come from? Well, I can help you. They don't come from azaleas. They don't come from yews. They don't come from hollies. They come from native plants. And oaks as a genus are rock stars. They provide a meaningful home to over 500 different species of insects. So in the wintertime, when you see those birds running up and down, and in the springtime running up and down the stems of those branches, they're not up there because it's a good view. They're up there for lunch, right? They're up there for dinner. They're collecting those insects and they're taking them back. And so the whole native world, from trees to a perennial ground cover, is all about that life cycle and supporting that life cycle. You mentioned some communities are kind of confused about that. And so, as you know, and many of you know, I'm a city councilman with the city of Maryland Heights. So I'm very involved with the state municipal league and the local municipal league, and coming up with meaningful statutes, meaningful ordinances that allow people to do and respond are good things, right? A good law is a law that everybody follows. So everybody loves to call on their neighbor when their neighbor's yard is more than 18 inches tall, because we think we all deserve a golf course green next door, right? And as a good friend of mine calls lawn, drug-addicted green carpet, because of how much nitrogen and phosphorus and insecticides and fungicides. There's a whole industry that's I can't say bloomed, that has grown up over the whole need for all of these inputs. And it's not too much different than commercial agriculture. The big farm requires all of these inputs. But if we just take a step back to what we understood was happening 100 years ago, 100 years ago, we were using native plants. We weren't so worried about all of these sterile cultivars. And sterile cultivars, where did that get us? The Bradford pear was a sterile cultivar, and so was the Aristocrat pear, and so was the Cleveland Select pear. But when you put them next to one another, they create viable fruit, and now they're on our right-of-ways. So it goes trying to evolve the conversation, right? So getting municipalities to understand that natives are a thing. So I would tell you that there is a move afoot within the municipal world to try to figure out how to do native plants. How do you identify a native plant gardening? How do you make it purposeful? How do you make it identifiable? If you followed St. Louis County just recently, all of their inspectors said, we can't help. We don't know. You've created a law that's impossible for us to enforce. So who stepped forward? The Missouri Botanical Garden and Jean Ponzi and her crew, and did a big training for all the county inspectors on how to identify good stuff versus the evil invasive weeds.
And so when you drive down the highways and you see some of the brush that's overgrown, a lot of it, like on 270, you'll see a lot of Bradford pears, or you did, like near Mercy Hospital for a while. I'm not sure what the latest is there, because I don't recall what it looked like this past spring. But there is a lot of overgrowth, and I'm not sure what percentage of it is what percentage is native and which is invasive.
Right. So great thought there. The question about invasive and native is, if we were to create a plant that would outcompete everything else, we would design it as an exercise in an engineering class to green up early in the spring, have a flower that's pollinated by anything and everything that can pollinate it, has a fruit that would be drug addicted, sweet like cocaine perhaps, like the honeysuckle berry, and then those leaves hold on late until the fall, till after frost. And so when you think of those 4 items, you've created bush honeysuckle. And bush honeysuckle was one of those, well, it seemed like such a good idea at the time, right? It was introduced by the Plant Materials Center out of Ellsbury, Missouri, back in the early 70s. I can tell you for a fact, when Dr. Steermark wrote the very first Flora of Missouri and published it back in 1963, bush honeysuckle did not exist in the state of Missouri. Period. It was not here.